I'm Abhishek. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Appsmith. This month is a really special month for everybody involved in open source. This is October, very famous for Hacktoberfest. As a part of our Hacktoberfest events, I have with me a really special guest, JJ or Joseph Jacks, who's a founder of OSS Capital and is a long time open source contributor and open source entrepreneur. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking to JJ about open source, community, Web 3.0, and all of these things that JJ is really interested in. So welcome, JJ. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Abhishek.
So JJ, you started your career at Talend, one of the original commercial open source projects. Could you talk to us a little bit about how did you get into Talend and what was your open source journey like?
Sure. Yeah, I was very fortunate to actually, it's like my third job ever working at Talend. I was one of their early salespeople, one of their account executives in the United States. Originally, they were a French company, and then they were kind of a few years in, started to go to market internationally, building a team in the United States. And yeah, it was a pretty random, like, happy accident learning about Talend and then joining them really early. I would say open source is a little different than the Talend journey. My older brother's a programmer, and I learned a lot about like Java, Python, Perl, C++, and stuff as a kid, looking at a lot of the O'Reilly books and basically getting influenced by my older brother. So I learned about the sort of general idea or concept of open source through, I guess, basically programming, simple websites and learning about how computers work early on. But I ended up I guess, through very fortunate luck and happenstance, learning about Talend and joining them super early. And Talend, like you mentioned, was one of these super early companies that built a business around open source projects at the core. And so they basically created like GPL licensed open source data integration products. And those products became used by like millions of data engineers and data integration developers at a bunch of different companies. And then over time, Talend figured out how to build products for enterprise customers with additional security guarantees and features and governance capabilities and so forth. And they eventually built a pretty substantial business around that over time. They went public in 2016. But yeah, my journey really started at Talend. I was there for a couple of years, and over the course of my career, just continued to be really curious about open source, kind of the intersection of open source and building software companies with a really big emphasis on open source, like at the core of the business. And I just I just followed my curiosity and was very, very fortunate early on.
Nice. And after spending a couple of years working at Talend, then TIBCO, you also started a company that was built on top of Kubernetes. Is that right? And this was called Kistema. Could you tell us a little bit more about that company? Because this, again, was one of the very early companies which was trying to commercialize open source projects. Today, of course, there are so many well-known business models. But when you started working on Kistema, this was still quite unknown. So what was that experience like, starting that company and being part of Kubernetes, which today is everywhere? But back then, I'm sure it was just starting out. Must have been quite
scary. I was also, again, very lucky and fortunate to learn about Kubernetes actually just before it came out, and then when Google released it in the middle of 2014, which seems like centuries ago, but I guess wasn't that long ago. I was actually introduced to a different project that came out of UC Berkeley called Apache Mesos. And the Apache Mesos was sort of an academic predecessor to Kubernetes. and Google was considering using the Apache Mesos project as potentially a core system to build their sort of open version of their internal Borg system, their internal cluster management system. They eventually ended up deciding to build the entire system from scratch in Go and the Go programming language, and that was kind of the origin of Kubernetes. But yeah, I guess I again was just very fortunate to be a big believer that whatever Google would produce and create would end up becoming super successful. Not a super deep observation, but ended up being reasonably accurate. And so Kismatic was, I guess, like the first Kubernetes services company training. We educated a lot of people. We built like the first web UI for it was like an Angular based web UI for Kubernetes clusters. Did a lot of evangelism. Then through that, kind of connected the dots, and as the community started to grow in that first 6 months, year, started the conference around Kubernetes called KubeCon. I'm actually in Los Angeles right now at the most recent KubeCon event, which is really fun. But yeah, I think again, just being fortunate, right place, right time, paying attention to different trends in the world, and being super open-minded about taking risks. But yeah, that was I'd say it was reasonably early in this kind of commercial open source startup ecosystem. 2014 was definitely a while back, but this category goes back to Red Hat. Goes back to the mid 90s, the late 90s, and of course JBoss and ZenSource and Zimbra and many other companies that created commercial open source models as sort of a software company approach. But yeah, I think you point out something that's very true, which is like in the last 5 years in particular, 5 to 7 years in particular, it's been just incredibly high growth as an area for entrepreneurs, for startup founders, and for just the technology industry overall. Really warming up to this idea that you can create an open source technology first as sort of the step one, and then build a community and really create far more value for the world than otherwise would be possible with a fully proprietary approach. But then over time, there's ways to take that community and very efficiently access customers and service your customers, which tend to be a different audience and a different persona. And so a lot of these things have become a lot more understood. And I think today is actually a really special day as well. Not at all because of our conversation, but because of the GitLab IPO.
Correct. And GitLab went public today, and
GitLab just went public.
Well.
They're doing really well, and I think the really amazing thing about what Sid and Dimitri have built at GitLab is they've really educated the world at a new level on this open core model, and where you can build a very high growth, high performing, fast growing software company based on a really holistic commitment to open source at the core of the company. And obviously that bleeds into all these other things as well, like culture and hiring and strategy and engineering and everything else. So it's a pretty awesome time we're living in for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like 6 years ago when you were starting your startup, or rather 7 years ago, I don't think you would have expected so many public companies today. This year, as you've been tracking in your COS's newsletter, this year we've seen about nearly six public companies, I think, which started off as an open source project and then they went public. So it's clear that open source companies are great for community because you're creating a public good, but it's also great for their customers because you just get access to the source code, you get the ability to change and modify things if the original company is not working on it, and customers just seem to prefer it. Especially GitLab is an extraordinary example because they are going against Microsoft and GitHub, who are probably like two of the most dominant forces in the developer ecosystem. And GitLab proving that there is a way for GitLab to win, even though I think GitLab started maybe like 5 or 6 years after GitHub existed. The fact that they could start, build a really good project, and then turn it into a very successful commercial company is just like is extraordinary. So you must
I
be like
agree.
super thrilled, right? Because you've been working on open source and commercial open source for like over a decade now.
Yeah, I'm extremely fortunate. I can't say I saw any of this coming at all. Like, it was just completely surprising and really incredible. I think at a broader level, much of the tech industry has just benefited from the acceleration of connectivity, more people on the internet, the positive aspects of the global pandemic and coronavirus have accelerated digital transformation, digital adoption by probably a decade. And that has directly positively affected open source as well, like just as an open source movement, independent of commercial open source companies, which obviously indirectly benefit from that as well. I think the world of technology has overall been been doing really well. But yeah, for sure, I think the open source movements and commercial open source companies have grown at levels that I don't think anyone would have been able to predict, just a few years ago.
You know, so you talk a lot about community, and you started KubeCon, which has now been running for like the last 5 years. You also run the open source conference, the COSS conference, and you talk a lot about community and involving the people who are your users into the product and into the economy of your product. Could you talk a bit about that? What do you think of community in the software movements, and how can open source project maintainers involve the community a lot more? And how can contributors to these open source projects do a better job of participating in this movement?
Well, it's a lot of questions in there. Yeah, I think that
Yeah, we
the
can take it one at a time.
sure, yeah, the importance of community has never been higher, I think, in the history of building technology companies. Communities of all shapes and sizes, really. And I guess what I would say to start
And why
to
is that? Why do you think what is changing today that's making community such an essential part?
what one thought that I consider quite frequently these days is one reason could be from the point of view of capitalism. So what I think is super relevant and a big conversation in kind of all levels of finance, economics, and business over the last decade in particular, has been this huge shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And that shift is really profound. And I think that if you kind of dig into what stakeholder capitalism means, like the essence of it, it's really community driven, right? So,
Can you
shareholder
define that
capital.
for us, for people who are hearing
Sure.
this for the first time?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to sort of level setting on what is shareholder capitalism as opposed to stakeholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism is really defined as the sort of Milton Friedman school of thought. So Milton Friedman's like I think it's a Nobel Peace Prize winner from the sort of like a lot of economic theories, and basically he's famous for saying, the purpose of business is to generate profits, and the purpose of business is to increase value for shareholders. And he's really the father of shareholder capitalism. And that's kind of modern economics is kind of built on that school of thought. At the same time, though, right around when Milton Friedman was getting recognized for that work and his insights, there was sort of an inverse point of view that was forming and never really received the same level of recognition. But it's sort of not necessarily the inverse, but a more expansive point of view, which is to say, like, instead of saying the purpose of business is purely to serve the shareholders of the company and only to increase value for the shareholders of the company, the purpose of business is actually to think about what the company affects and how the company actually affects the world. And in order to say how do you become more community driven or affecting many of your constituents, this term stakeholder capitalism started to become codified, and there's actually a gentleman by the name of Professor Ed Freeman, Freeman, not Friedman. So it's a little confusing with Milton Friedman, Ed Freeman. But Ed Freeman is a professor at the University of Virginia, and he's actually the sort of the father of stakeholder capitalism. We've been very honored to have him speak at Open Core Summit last year, and I consider him a friend. Ed really codified this idea of stakeholder capitalism, which is to say the purpose of business is not just to service your shareholders, but is also to serve all of your stakeholders and add value for many constituents, essentially. So you think about the whatever the business is that you're building, if it's affecting society, governments, end users, customers, employees, investors, you really have to think holistically about how to harmonize and how to align all of the energy and the output of what you create in your business to really sort of, it sounds very hippie, but like synergize all of the impact that you have across all of those stakeholders. And I think the best businesses in the world are really those that have high levels of impact across many stakeholders, not just their shareholders. Those are really the most transformative and most impactful businesses in the world. Frankly, just think of Google. Biggest stakeholder, I think, for Google is people who use the internet, right? And the people who benefit from access to the world's information at an instantaneous level have received immeasurable value from Google without ever paying Google any money. At the same time, Google has created a business model called paid advertising, which allows them to basically create smarter recommendations for basically results that could be relevant to a specific query. But instead of charging us, the consumers of this amazing service, they charge businesses that would like to provide very relevant advertising based on query, search history, and so forth. So that's just one example. I think going full circle back to companies like Appsmith, the really beautiful thing about creating an open source community and a core open source technology at the heart of your company, and then over time creating a business and building products and services for customers who pay you money, is you're sort of inherently stakeholder capitalistic, as opposed to being shareholder capitalistic, where sort of the emphasis is much more on purely just making money for one stakeholder entity, which is your shareholders. With commercial open source companies, or open source companies, as a lot of people call them, I like to call them cost companies or commercial open source companies, because open source doesn't really, it's kind of a tangent. Open source isn't a business model, and it's also not a type of company. It's really a development model and an innovation model, and
I want to actually go deeper into that a little bit in the future, because I know you have strong opinions even on open source licenses and all the varieties that are coming up. But yeah, going back to what you were mentioning about stakeholder capitalism, I agree with you. Like with Appsmith, our focus is very much on building a public good that can be used by anybody and everybody. And it's been amazing to see nonprofits benefit from this, as well as small startups, universities, schools, people who might not ever have the budget for a proprietary software. The fact that they can use Appsmith for free, and it's okay if we never monetize them. That's perfectly fine, because the amount of feedback and the amount of work that they put in to make Appsmith better just makes it all worth it. They're often contributing bug fixes. Even if they're not contributing bug fixes, they're telling us something is wrong in our docs, or they're reporting issues. And all of this together, it's creating a product that everybody can use. All of us can use without having to worry about a middleman coming in and taking this away from us. And that's definitely like an extraordinary experience for me personally. So when it comes to stakeholder capitalism, how are you seeing the new movement around Web 3.0, the new crypto movements that are emerging? And a lot of them are new. And so it's difficult to say which of these will survive. But what has gotten you so excited about some of these new business models around crypto, around Web 3.0?
So I have a bit of a different point of view on crypto than I think most cryptocurrency Web3, diehard evangelists and sort of, I don't know, I guess you could say maximalists,
Right.
which is that I think cryptocurrency, the whole blockchain movement, is really a subset of commercial open source, and I'll unpack what I mean by that a little bit. Um, when Bitcoin was created, which is sort of the origin of this movement in 2000, I think it was 2008 or 2009. The paper came out with a sort of proclamation that digital money would be possible, and we can create the system that is trustless and verifiable and so forth with cryptographic guarantees and really interesting computer science ideas. And this movement really would not have happened if Satoshi Nakamoto just released that paper and published it to the internet. What also had to happen was a software implementation of the ideas in that paper. And so what happened was there was basically a C++ implementation of the Bitcoin ideas released as an open source project, an MIT licensed open source project. And here's the fascinating thing is I don't think that the Bitcoin idea and the project itself would have been possible at all without open source being invented before it. And I think that brings up kind of an interesting point that I've learned over the years a lot of people don't quite appreciate, which is that open source was actually invented by people. Like the fundamental idea. Open source originally was called free software, and it was invented by this guy named Richard Stallman at MIT in the early 80s, in the early to mid 80s, 1980s. Richard has somewhat of a polarizing personality and background in a lot of ways, but around 1998, about 15 years after the free software movement really took off, a group of people came together, basically rebranded the free software movement to something called open source. And that's really what we see at a broader level in society as the sort of the term du jour to refer back to Stallman's ideas. And open source really took off in a new way from 1998 onwards. Really, the sort of the rise of the internet, and then fast forward to 22 years to today, 2021. But going back to Richard for just a brief moment, Richard was actually motivated to create free software as an idea, as a design, because of Bill Gates, primarily. Bill Gates wrote a letter to the hobbyists that were sort of tinkering with Microsoft's early technologies and projects, and also his sort of end user and developer community, as well as some of their customers. And his statements in that letter were really the origins of the proprietary software movement. And I believe that letter was written in 1976. So just a few years.
Read that. I should look that up.
Yeah, and in that letter, Bill basically proposed the idea of software licensing, charging money for people to use a piece of software. And Richard really took great objection to this idea. In fact, he really hated it. I see someone in the chat referring to Eric Raymond's book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. This is an excellent book. I definitely encourage people to read it. Eric is, along with Bruce Perrins, who's a good friend of mine and one of our partners at Oasis Capital, the co-founder of this kind of open source movement and the term open source. But going back to Richard for a second, when Richard read Bill Gates's letter, he was like, we have to create something. I'm just kind of thinking in my imagination, this is what was going through his head, which is probably roughly accurate. Like, we have to create something that is the opposite of this, right? And so Bill, really used this idea of proprietary software licensing, and it was easy for people to understand that you should pay money for it because the software is giving you a lot of value, and it's expensive to build, and the engineers who build it are using their valuable time, and it's costly and so forth. So you should pay money to use the software. Bill, I think, was a benefactor of something that came before him a lot longer, probably almost a century plus, which is this idea of intellectual property or copyright. And the idea of intellectual property and copyright, I won't get into the history of that. People also invented that, by the way. But intellectual property is a fascinating thing because up until that Bill Gates letter to hobbyists in 1976, software was not considered intellectual property. And this idea of copyright, which again was invented decades before Bill Gates, was never really applied to the idea of software source code and charging money for that through licenses. And so I think what Richard designed, which was a really brilliant and profoundly world-changing design, was how do we come up with the opposite of copyright? And that's how we came to the idea of copyleft. So instead of copyright, we have copyleft. So it's kind of a clever term. And that's what really serves as the basis for all things open source. All things open source stem from this idea of copyleft, where instead of saying you have to protect the intellectual property, it actually says you have to give away the intellectual property and you have to create a permissiveness and inclusive model for the software to always be viewed as really kind of community centric and almost a common good. And so Richard designed the very first open source or then called free software license, the GPL license, the GNU public license, which has gone through various versions. But really over the years, and even with the open source licenses that exist today, they're standing on the shoulders of that design and that framework. And so Richard proposed four sort of variables and four key dimensions that should always be honored and always be adhered to. He called them the four freedoms: freedoms 0, 1, 2, and 3. This is Richard's a computer scientist. The first number is a 0 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. Basically, the idea was the software should always be visible and transparent. The software should always be distributable by anyone. Software should be changeable by anyone. And the software essentially should be always commercializable or monetizable in any context by anyone. Those are the rough general ideas of the sort of the four freedoms. And it's kind of similar to the Bill of Rights or our Declaration of Independence in the United States, like sort of a rights framework, but instead of for people, for software. And I believe that those are very profound ideas that Richard invented. But open source came along and was branded in 1998 to sort of make those ideas more accessible for business people and for the world at large. Because Richard kind of, I believe, and I think most people in the business world agree, that he held back a lot of the broader awareness because of just an intensely ideological point of view. And really, these ideas are incredibly general purpose and applicable to everyone. So going to the Web3 movement, to kind of circle back to my attempt at answering your question there, I think that Web3 and crypto would not exist without Stallman's invention. They would also not exist without the rebranding in 1998. But more fundamentally, Web3, I believe, is sort of a subset of commercial open source because all the blockchains that succeed are open source, and blockchains happen to have a tight coupling of an economic model built into the software, which is to say you have a token and you can assign an economic value to that token, and basically build a coordination system around that. So I think that, I'm still warming up to certain aspects of the movement and blockchains in general. I am a huge fan. I think the idea that you can create digital scarcity, cryptographically verifiable digital scarcity, is an extremely exciting idea. And I believe that we're just slowly starting to see a lot of proof that these ideas can really can really change the world in a very positive way.
Yeah. So the thing that's interesting about blockchain is it's not only is the software, so to speak, or the program is open source, but all the data as well. It's all out there for anybody to look at, anybody to verify, and that's really super interesting. And what you were talking about before about Richard Stallman's fundamental beliefs, I think there's a parallel that exists in the hardware world. In the world of hardware, or when you're buying a car, you want the right to be able to fix it yourself, to open it, understand how it works, and fix it. It's weird that we forgot about that when we created software. And today, of course, large companies are working hard to take away our right to fix things and completely centralize it. But I see that open source is, in a way, going back to the natural laws that we have as people, that if I own something, I should be able to modify it, fix it, tinker with it, and resell it if I need to. And those rights are just like natural rights that I think open source software is bringing back, and it's exciting to see that. Around NFTs, especially, yeah, I think there's definitely a lot happening, and it's difficult to say what is real versus what is somebody trying to just shill and trying to monetize the excitement that there is. But I think the cool thing about NFTs is that again, in the real world, we have ownership of things, and even if that thing can be copied, it doesn't reduce the value of the thing that I have. And NFTs is a way of trying to again bring back that sort of a, I guess, like experience or principles, but to the digital world. I mean, I think anybody who's ever bought diamonds, if if you don't understand NFTs, I think it's difficult to convince you uh, any other way, right? If you've paid for a diamond or rock, which is worthless, doesn't do anything, uh, but you've paid for it. So I think that's how I understood NFTs at least. And
I think you actually make a really, really interesting point. So, by the way, I'm a huge fan of NFTs in general. I don't really participate much in the NFT movement on a personal level. Our fund has made a couple of investments, and we're actually creating a really fun promotional program for our third Open Core Summit annual conference later this year. We're creating NFTs for all the funding announcements. By the way, Appsmith will have an NFT celebrating your recent
Nice.
$10 million series announcement that you made. And, I think you just said something really fascinating, though, about this idea of ownership and the idea of purchasing things that are believed to be scarce. So maybe we can use one example of a commodity that is increasingly viewed as not such a great store of value anymore, which is gold, right?
Yeah.
And so gold itself, up until a few decades ago, was really the primary way that global economies operated. We had the golden standard, literally gold, and our U.S. Currency was actually backed by gold bullion and vaults and physical locations and so forth. And I think if you actually look at from a fundamental physics kind of point of view, in the recent decades, even independent of the invention of Bitcoin and the invention of the internet, we had the ability to go and explore space with interstellar rockets in the 60s, and we really slowed the pace of innovation. But the reason I bring this up is with more recent advances in rocket technology, we have the ability to go do mining of asteroids that are actually not so far away from our planet. And in certain asteroids, the gold reserves that exist on those asteroids exceeds the total supply of gold that exists on Earth by something like multiple orders of magnitude, right? And so if we view gold as a scarce resource here on our planet Earth, with the technology that we have to expand our reach and access to gold outside of our outside of our immediate planet, things profoundly change with that breakthrough. So I think one other
if
thought
that kind of scarcity,
yes,
if that
yes.
kind of scarcity actually applied, wood has to be the most expensive thing because there is no wood
Wood.
outside of Earth, right? That should be more expensive. But
one other thing that you said that I feel I just actually realized just in this conversation, actually, so I have to tweet this after our conversation. But the most common resistance to NFTs, value, utility, interestingness, whatever characteristic you'd like to apply, is what the hell? This is like some useless thing. I can just copy and paste the JPEG. There's no value. And I think you could say the same thing of open source projects. You have the ability to fork and copy the code at any time. But do you say that the project is useless or worthless because of that? You certainly don't. And so I guess you have to figure out a better way to express that. But I think that the equivalence there is identical. NFTs can certainly be copy and pasted. The bits, the data that NFTs represent can be copied and pasted from one computer to another computer. But that does not mean that the NFTs do not have utility or do not have value or do not have usefulness. And so I think we're slowly starting to realize that.
You can take pictures of the Mona Lisa, you can print them out, you can have something that's bigger than the real Mona Lisa, but it doesn't reduce the value of the original Mona Lisa. It does. It represents something else. And
I would argue it increases the value because you took a picture, maybe you shared a picture with your friend, and now your friend knows about the Mona Lisa, and before that didn't, and so there's more distribution of the Mona Lisa. So I would argue it could even increase the value.
Correct, exactly. Yeah, and that's where do you see parallels between what blockchain or what crypto is doing around incentivizing stakeholders, incentivizing users? Do you see parallels of that applying to open source? And do you have ideas or wishes for how open source projects could maybe make use of those similar principles and engage with the community?
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, I think I talk with a lot of the founders that we've been lucky to invest in about this pretty regularly. And there's a lot of experiments people are doing that I think are super fascinating around basically creating incentive systems for contribution, incentive systems for distribution, for usage through the application of blockchain technology, basically, and cryptocurrencies. Whether it's NFT technology or NFT implementations, or just building a token on something like Ethereum. I think there's so many potential ideas that are floating around. It would be very, very unwise to ignore the really profound potential of cryptocurrencies to, frankly, disrupt and really transform the entire software industry, which if you include any company that is fundamentally based on digital technology, which, by the way, includes a lot of logistics companies and e-commerce companies and internet companies. We're talking about a, I don't know, $15 trillion category in the global economy, which is, I don't know, probably about 10% of the global economic activity on Earth. Pretty huge. So I'd say that I don't know what will happen over time and how things will unfold. But I think the world is clearly headed in a direction where software and specifically connected software, in other words, blockchains, will disintermediate and disrupt, very inefficient licensing models, business models that came before.
Yeah, I think, even we at Appsmith, we've been trying to figure out if there is a way by which we could work better with our contributors. Today, we ship swag to our contributors for contributing code. But hopefully in the future, we can figure out a better way so that people who may not be able to have free time to contribute are incentivized to contribute so that they actually find some economic value in participating and contributing to Appsmith.
I will say one thing that I have slight resistance to, which is this idea of applying extrinsic incentives in areas that are intensely intrinsic. And so I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit more in case people don't fully appreciate the difference between intrinsic motivation incentives and extrinsic motivation incentives. Extrinsic really means that you're doing something with an expectation to be paid for it. Intrinsic means that you're doing something with no expectation to be paid, and you're doing it purely because you really love doing it, like you're just passionate about doing it. That's essentially the difference. In open source, I believe the vast majority, and probably 90+% of the pure motivation for activity, coordination, contribution, creation is intrinsic. It is not extrinsic. We're seeing a bit of a change with commercial open source companies and founders in general in the software industry going, I can create an open source project. Maybe it's the open source alternative for X, and then I can create a company. And that's kind of an extrinsic motivation. I want to create the company. Maybe I can raise some venture capital. Maybe I can create the next GitLab. So this is becoming more easy to kind of connect the dots to. But I think fundamentally, the open source movement is driven by millions of developers who are intrinsically motivated. And one fear I have is that, someone I'd say I consider a friend, but I have very strong disagreements with, Balaji Srinivasan, really promotes this idea that blockchains are what come next after open source. Or I think he says open state is what comes next after open source. And what he means by open state is you have a blockchain. It's basically a distributed transaction ledger, and you can verify and transparently see all the transactions. And you can also verifiably trust the state of those transactions, in addition to the fact that the software is also open source. So it's kind of open source plus open state. I think there's like some maybe violent agreement in the nuances, but if you apply blockchains and extrinsic incentive systems, which is to say you're going to be monetarily rewarded for some activity, and you apply that to too many things that are largely intrinsic, I think that the results will be undesirable in a lot of ways. Which is to say, you might introduce perverse incentives, you might dissuade or discourage contribution because of just negative game theoretic elements. There's a lot of complexities to this. And so I actually really fear that because of too much intense obsession with we must tokenize or cryptoize all the things, there's a big part of the technology ecosystem that will feel left out or feel excluded because of this kind of view that blockchains could be a panacea to solve all the problems. And so I think that there are a lot of non-economic problems in open source that stem from like issues completely orthogonal to how you make money with things. For example, human nature and human philosophy plays a big role in open source. Ego, entitlement. those types of dimensions that are completely non-monetary in my view. But generally speaking, I'm very optimistic about the future of all of that.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. I hadn't thought about it that carefully, but the fact is, I think research has proven that uh, if you incentivize somebody to perform better, uh, they often perform worse than they were performing before they were incentivized, because you're suddenly turning something that used to be fun into a job, into
Right.
work, and that's a really interesting point of view. Even the way Appsmith started, which was Arpit and then later Nikhil joining him, they did do it purely as a project that they were moonlighting on the side. The real idea of turning it into a company came about quite a bit later. But the fact is, I think Arpit basically said that he doesn't care what happens to Appsmith as a company, but he's going to work on it as a project. Uh, and that was an incentive from day one, and it continues to be one of his aims, which is why he focuses so much only on the open source community. So that's a really interesting point. I think it's going to be interesting to see if there is a model that uh, doesn't eliminate the intrinsic motivation while trying to reward some sort of other behavior. So that's going to be like super interesting.
I agree.
So JJ, we have a little bit time left. I think we have another 5 minutes. So I'd love to shift gears, and I'd love for you to talk a bit about what is it that excites you about Appsmith, and what is it that you are looking forward to over the next few years from Appsmith. So for folks who don't know, JJ is actually an investor in Appsmith through his fund, which is the world's first and probably till date the only fund focused on open source investments. So JJ has been a big supporter of Appsmith. So I'd love to know, JJ, what are you excited about in Appsmith, and what does the future look like?
Thank you very much, Abhishek, for including us in your journey, and we're really honored to have the privilege to support and be investors in Appsmith. When we started OSS Capital, the idea was to create really a venture fund focusing on investing in for-profit companies, startups that are building businesses around open source projects. We call them commercial open source startups, and open core oriented software companies. To be clear, we don't invest in open source projects. We invest in companies built around a core, typically a singular core open source technology, a core open source project. So I just wanted to make that distinction. But I think with Appsmith, one thing that was very, very clearly evident was your ability to create a lot of excitement and adoption in a short period of time around really this huge trend we've seen over the last few years of low code and no code development on the internet. I mean, really started from building websites with things like Webflow and Squarespace and other huge platforms that have been.
We were before that.
Absolutely, and tools that have existed to really simplify the development of application software and web development for really non-programmers and non-technical people. And so there's a lot of tools there. I think low code and no code as buzzwords tend to be somewhat blurry, but what I think Appsmith is just really exciting about in a lot of different dimensions is that you have this ability to reduce the friction and reduce the complexity to create arbitrarily complex, meaning to simple to very, very complicated software as a non-programmer, as a non-technical person, literally just by dragging and dropping and clicking buttons and entering text in English, and out comes an application that actually works and solves your business problem. And I think this is like really incredible technology that we need more. We need more innovation around. We need more products and services. We need more infrastructure to basically make it possible for, frankly, the billions of people who use the internet to create software. And I'm a massive fan of more progress and more development in all of these areas. I think that Appsmith really has the potential to be one of the next commercial open source IPOs in the next 5 to 10 years. I think the market is very clearly validated from a wide range of approaches. There's a lot of fully proprietary tools that are doing extremely well. There's a wide range of developer-driven tools in different verticals. There's tools that focus on healthcare and life sciences and financial services, and there's tools that are more horizontal that service all kinds of industries. And so I'm just a massive fan of what you've been doing, and in such a short period of time, you've been able to prove that people really love your tool and what you've built. And I think the future is just extremely promising.
Thanks, JJ. Yeah, I think for us also, it did emerge from the fact that there were no open source ways of building software as rapidly as you could using Salesforce Lightning Platform or Microsoft Power Apps. And Microsoft also used to have Visual Basic, which now, of course, is dead. But those used to be, they're all proprietary, and it made no sense that there was no community good or no public good that was available to everybody. The fact that all of these products were locked up behind a paywall, most of these products are not free. And second is, you cannot actually modify the language or understand how the programming language works underneath so that you can move faster. And that was definitely an inspiration for us to start Appsmith. And yeah, I really appreciate your support here and for backing us. Before we end, I have one question for you. Imagine it's the year 2025 or the year 2030. What do you think something like Appsmith should have become by then?
I think it's possible to build a public company by then. I really do. And as crazy as that sounds, the cycle times for going from startup stage to public company have shortened and really shrunk to levels that have never been seen, maybe perhaps since the dot-com bubble in the year 2000, 21 years ago. But I think that there's a really interesting change in that a lot of the companies that have gone public, not all of them, but many of them in very short periods of time have created huge communities, massive customer bases, very large, significant revenue and high growth businesses that are really durable and long lasting and can actually continue to grow and compound that growth. And so if you actually reach a certain level of market validation and revenue, taking a company public is really just another milestone along the way, just like raising your Series A. And GitLab's public today, but if you read the S1, the CEO Sid is incentivized to take the stock price not from $77, which I think was the pricing, but to 100 and 200 and 500. And I think the markets are really ready and available for the size of businesses that even potentially rival that of Stripe and Uber and maybe even potentially Microsoft and Facebook. Yeah. So I think we're still very early in the technology industry in general. I think there are going to be more $100 billion companies than ever imaginable 5+ years from now. I think there is also going to be more $1 trillion companies than anyone ever thought imaginable 5+ years from now.
Yeah, amen to that. I'm hoping we get there someday. Thank you so much, JJ, for spending time with me today and talking about all of this. And thank you everyone who's watching us on YouTube and for joining us today. We'll be back again next Thursday talking about a few more things related to Hacktoberfest and also building more fun things on Appsmith. So thank you so much for joining us today and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Abhishek. Great to see you.
Bye.
Bye.